Let's get philosophical. Critical Reflections on Conspiracy Theory. Authored by Kurtis Hagen. The following podcast episode is the first of a three-part series on the reliability of the media regarding conspiracy theories. This episode is based on material taken from an article entitled, "Is Conspiracy Theorizing Really Epistemically Problematic?" published in the journal Episteme in 2020, by Kurtis Hagen, which is a response to an article by philosopher Keith Harris. While discussion of the media's reliability is tangential to the main argument of the article, it was included there in order to address the concerns of a reviewer who seemed to share Harris's optimistic view.
Is the mainstream media reliable regarding conspiracy theories? Part 1, a response to Keith Harris's optimistic view. The philosopher Keith Harris expresses optimism about the reliability of the mainstream media in an article titled, "What's Epistemically Wrong with Conspiracy Theorizing?" He suggests that it is better to adhere passively to the mainstream perspective than to actively consult non-mainstream sources. Is such optimism really warranted when it comes to contested interpretations of events? I will argue that it is not. Although Harris does not actually say very much about the media, responding adequately to what he does say requires saying a fair amount. The burden of providing empirical evidence, it seems to me, should really rest on Harris, since he is advancing a position which is in some respects audacious, namely, that people should shut themselves off from sources of information outside mainstream channels. Yet Harris has not provided an empirical case. Instead, he relies mainly upon a simple intuition about what will suffice to adequately ensure the reliability of the mainstream media. Nevertheless, Harris's position deserves a response since this intuition is one that many people seem ready to accept, even when counterintuitions are presented. And so, I respond with examples, as well as conceptual analysis, suggesting that Harris's optimistic view regarding the reliability of the mainstream media is misguided. Let's consider Harris's argument in support of his optimistic view. He reasons as follows.
The official account, promoted by mainstream sources, is subjected to at least some degree of truth-oriented filtering. The mere fact that mainstream sources enjoy more attention ensures that, at least when it comes to simple questions of fact, errors are comparatively likely to be noticed and corrected. Moreover, mainstream purveyors of information have a powerful incentive to avoid errors and to correct erroneous reporting, as uncorrected errors are likely to lead consumers to defect to alternative sources in the media marketplace.
Based on this, Harris seems to suggest we should defer to the account promoted by mainstream sources and refrain from consulting alternative sources. He explains.
The collection of additional evidence may leave one worse off, epistemically, when that evidence is drawn from a biased pool.
There are many problems with Harris's analysis. First, nearly everything is subjected to at least some degree of truth-oriented filtering. So, without some quantification, applying this to the mainstream media is pretty meaningless. The degree to which the mainstream does a better job than other sources, after all, presumably varies. Some of these other sources may be published in respectable venues. Peter Dale Scott's The Road to 9/11, for example, is published by the University of California Press. Second, there is at least some tension between the idea that the mainstream media can be trusted because it is heavily scrutinized, and the idea that, because it can be trusted, it need not be scrutinized. Or that, at least, one should not expose oneself to information outside the mainstream media, where one is likely to encounter ideas that challenge the mainstream view that would help one scrutinize it. Third, the question is not whether the media generally gets things right, it is whether they are reliable when it comes to certain kinds of controversial issues, such as war provocations, or political assassinations. The U.S. mainstream media's promotion of the Iraq War, for example, was seriously flawed. And it is not the case that the mainstream media quickly corrected all their errors. Although it is commonly reported that everybody thought Iraq had WMDs, there was never strong evidence supporting this, and plenty of people knew it. In an article titled, Blix insists there was no firm weapons evidence, lead UN weapons inspector Hans Blix states, quote, "We reported consistently that we found no weapons of mass destruction," unquote. In addition, a pre-war memo, dated January 31, 2003, confirms that George Bush and Tony Blair believed that weapons were not going to be found. This is why they were looking for other ways to justify an invasion. The mainstream media tends to whitewash the relevant history by framing the Iraq War as an honest mistake, despite strong reasons to think it was not. Paul Krugman puts the point well in a 2015 opinion piece, Errors and Lies. He writes,
"There's a palpable sense right now of the political and media elite trying to draw a line under the subject. Yes, the narrative goes, we now know that invading Iraq was a terrible mistake, and it's about time that everyone admits it. Now let's move on. Well, let's not, because that's a false narrative, and everyone who was involved in the debate over the war knows that it's false. The Iraq War wasn't an innocent mistake, a venture undertaken on the basis of intelligence that turned out to be wrong. America invaded Iraq because the Bush administration wanted a war. The public justifications for the invasion were nothing but pretexts, and falsified pretexts at that. We were, in a fundamental sense, lied into war. The fraudulence of the case for war was actually obvious even at the time. The ever-shifting arguments for an unchanging goal were a dead giveaway."
While this opinion piece was published in the New York Times, to its credit, it nevertheless supports the view that the mainstream media was not typically reporting the truth on this issue. It continues, predominantly, to report the orchestrated lies of the Bush administration as innocent mistakes which everybody at the time believed to be true. Regarding what I referred to as orchestrated lies, Charles Lewis writes,
"The carefully orchestrated campaign of untruths about Iraq's alleged threat to U.S. national security from its WMDs or links to al-Qaeda, also specious, galvanized public opinion and led the nation to war under decidedly false pretenses."
Fourth, the fact that the mainstream media has incentives against misreporting simple matters of fact does not make it an unbiased pool of information, as Harris implies. Fox and MSNBC, for example, frequently support contrasting, and seemingly biased narratives. One study even suggests that exposure to Fox News and MSNBC, which are described as partisan sources, has a negative impact on people's current events knowledge. Most people would do better to watch the comedic Daily Show. Also, the perspectives promoted in the mainstream media of other countries differ from those promoted in the US media, despite the fact that they have the same supposedly powerful incentives to get things right. Rather than developing one's views based on a single mainstream source, it is probably wiser to base it on multiple mainstream sources with different perspectives. But if that is true, might not expanding one's net a bit further, if done carefully, be wiser still? Harris has not given sufficiently strong reasons to confidently answer no. Fifth, when the mainstream media gets important simple questions of fact wrong, we cannot simply trust them to discover and correct those errors, at least not when they relate to conspiracy theories. For example, when asked about the result of a paraffin test on Lee Harvey Oswald, Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry responded, quote, "I understand that it was positive," unquote. Curry explains, quote, "It only means that he fired a gun," unquote. Curry is referring to the tests on Oswald's hands. Upon further questioning, Curry said that he didn't know the results for Oswald's cheeks. Those results, actually, were negative, a fact that seems to have been revealed by conspiracy theorist Mark Lane. The media, perhaps through mere incompetence, or perhaps being overeager for a good story, or even moved by misplaced patriotism, proceeded to state or imply, in various formulations, that the paraffin tests showed that Oswald had fired a rifle that day, and thus had killed the president. In fact, the cheek results suggested that he had not fired a rifle. And even Curry's statement, "It only means that he fired a gun," stretches the truth, even if the statement was perfectly sincere, since paraffin tests are not, in fact, conclusive. Despite the evidential ambiguity of the actual situation, the media essentially convicted Oswald on the basis of Curry's comments. Regardless of whether or not Oswald was actually the lone gunman, this was misleading reporting that was extremely prejudicial, even if sincere and well-intended, or mostly so. How typical is this kind of reporting in such cases? It is beyond the scope of this paper to answer. But Harris has not provided adequate justification for complacency. Even when incorrect statements of simple matters of fact are corrected, the correction often is much less impactful than the erroneous original claim. As an example of the mainstream media apparently getting even basic matters of fact wrong, consider Novus, Cold Case, JFK. The program makes much of the supposed 3-centimeter entry wound on Governor Connolly's back. This is used to support the single bullet theory by suggesting that the bullet yawed after passing through Kennedy's neck. One has to go outside the mainstream media to find a critique, by Gary Aguilar and the distinguished forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht, that points out that the House Select Committee on Assassinations report authoritatively indicated the following facts.
The rear entrance wound was not 3 centimeters in diameter, as indicated in one of the operative notes. It was a puncture-type wound, as if a bullet had struck the body at a slight declination, i.e., not at a right angle. The wound was actually approximately 1.5 centimeters in diameter. The ragged edges of the wound were surgically cut away, effectively enlarging it to approximately 3 centimeters.
Aguilar and Wecht also point out that this is corroborated by the size of the holes through Connolly's jacket and shirt, 1.5 centimeters and 1.3 centimeters respectively. So, it seems that much of Novus' analysis is based on a false premise. I'm not aware of any correction or retraction on the part of Nova or PBS regarding this matter. If there was one, few would know. Aguilar suggests that this case exemplifies the fact that, quote, junk science continues to snooker the mainstream media, unquote. In fairness, it may be that a convincing response to Aguilar and Wecht is possible, and that Nova and its experts are right after all, though I think there are strong reasons to view this as unlikely, as even Haag himself later accepts the 1.5 centimeter figure. In any case, the question at hand is this: are we really justified in resting assured that the Nova presentation was accurate simply because mainstream media sources have an incentive not to present simple matters of fact incorrectly? And that critiques are therefore not even due a hearing? This does not seem right. Let's briefly consider one last example, namely, Russiagate. The key element in Russiagate is that President Trump is supposed to have colluded with the Russians to inappropriately influence the 2016 election. The Russiagate case has the interesting twist that it is the mainstream media that seems to be promoting a conspiracy theory. Glenn Greenwald, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who played a significant role in bringing to light Snowden's NSA spying revelations, argues that the mainstream media, 1. got the Russiagate story wrong, 2. has not owned up to it, 3. will face no consequences for irresponsible and misleading reporting, and 4. all this has destroyed the credibility of the U.S. media. Greenwald's rant on Democracy Now! Is worth quoting at length. He says,
We, i.e. the mainstream media, were talking about Putin blackmailing Donald Trump with PP tapes and Donald Trump being a Russian agent since 1987, which was a cover story that was on New York Magazine, that Chris Hayes put on MSNBC. Just all kinds of moronic conspiracies, that we love to mock other countries' medias for circulating and disseminating, drowned out our airwaves and our discourse for 3 years. The game is over, and it's time to be honest about it. And the more we try to cling to this and invent new, you know what it reminds me of? In 2003, when the neocons finally had to face the truth that there were no WMDs, that they had fabricated that the media had misled millions of people around the world for years, and they started saying, maybe Saddam hid them in Syria. Maybe they're buried in places we just haven't looked yet. It's time to face the truth. The media got this story wrong. They obsessed on this for 3 years, and all this time there was no evidence for it. It was just a conspiracy theory. Rachel Maddow, the most influential liberal TV host in the country, every single night misled millions of liberals into believing something that was totally false, and there will be no media consequences for it.
It is beyond the scope of this article to establish that Greenwald's perspective is correct. But it is not obvious that he is wrong. How should we decide? According to Harris's reasoning, we don't need to even try to weigh the evidence. Rather, we should assume that Greenwald is most probably wrong, and we should leave it at that, because what he is asserting is not compatible with a simple heuristic. The mainstream media has an incentive to get things right and to quickly correct themselves when they screw up. But that is just not adequate. Sixth, the idea that the mainstream media get simple questions of fact right and that errors are unfailingly corrected is not only wrong, it is a non sequitur. An official account, after all, is generally a complex theory, not a simple question of fact. Although the media does sometimes significantly misreport facts relevant to conspiracy theories, perhaps the greater worry, leading people to seek additional information, involves what the mainstream leaves out or fails to emphasize. The media may faithfully report selective matters of fact that support a particular theory, while largely ignoring so-called errant data. For example, many in the 9/11 Truth movement believe the collapse of Building 7 is particularly significant, and they often point out that, though shown on TV as it happened, it was seldom shown again for many years. And the 1921 Tulsa massacre, for instance, was left out of history books for decades. Also, during the decade between Jeffrey Epstein's 2008 sweetheart plea deal and Julie Brown's 2018 reporting in the Miami Herald, the mainstream media was relatively quiet regarding Epstein. Many voices in the alternative media, however, were raising the alarm. Some of the speculations put forth there may have been poorly grounded or exaggerated, but the main idea did pan out. Epstein was a well-connected serial pedophile, who had been given strangely favorable treatment by the authorities. In the wake of his death there remain a number of issues that seem to call for further exploration and potential prosecution. Should we simply trust the mainstream media to cover those? For abundant examples of underreported stories, see the books published annually by Project Censored. Finally, there is also the reality of spin. When purported errant data is addressed by the media, it is not always addressed in a fair and competent way. For example, the National Geographic documentary, 9/11 Science and Conspiracy, employed so-called experts to perform an experiment to answer the following question.
Can thermite of any kind burn through steel beams?
They succeeded in showing that even large quantities of the weakest form of thermite cannot cut through a steel beam when uncreatively deployed. The clear intent is to leave the impression that thermite, of any kind, cannot have been used in the destruction of the WTC towers. But the underlying reasoning is patently invalid. And the implied conclusion that thermite cannot cut through steel beams appears to be falsified by more creative attempts using relatively small amounts of stronger forms of thermite. The bottom line is this: Harris has not shown that consulting non-mainstream sources is problematic, or that we are best advised to uncritically trust views promoted in our mainstream media. A conspiracy theorist may have specific reasons, as well as general reasons, to think that mainstream sources are biased on a particular issue. They may have spot-checked facts and found at least some of the mainstream media reporting to be skewed. Reliably determining what is most likely true regarding any particular controversy requires scrutinizing the evidentiary details. Consulting alternative sources can be helpful in this process. Blindly trusting the mainstream media's narrative, in contrast, is not wise.
You have been listening to modified portions of an article entitled, "Is Conspiracy Theorizing Really Epistemically Problematic?" published in the journal Episteme in 2020, by Kurtis Hagen.